Hey, everybody. Very excited to keep the conversation going on today's day of conversation. And in this next block, I am very excited. We are joined by Alicia Armstrong, the clinical manager at ERC Pathlight, who oversees the virtual binge eating disorder program. And today, we are going to be talking all about binge eating disorder and what makes it different.
Yeah,
So, Alicia, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us and having this
definitely.
conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me and for organizing all of this. It's a lot of work, I'm sure, and much appreciated
Yeah.
by everybody. I know.
Yeah, it's been really cool getting to do it though. So, yeah, to jump right into it, I know it's a big question, and this might be, just a perspective here, but from your side, what is different about binge eating disorder in the full landscape of eating disorders and treatment and support? Why is BED unique?
I think there's probably two ways to look at the uniqueness of binge eating disorder. And one of the things being is that a lot of times people can approach it and think that it's so different from other eating disorders. And there are elements that actually aren't. They're so similar to other eating disorders. A lot of people don't realize that most people with binge eating disorder have some component of restriction as well. And so that's just one of those lesser known pieces about binge eating disorder where people might not necessarily consider that because the word binge eating is the predominant term used in that diagnosis. But I would say that there are certain things that are different. You can't necessarily look at somebody and say they've got binge eating disorder. But we do know that a lot of people with binge eating disorder struggle with body image distress in a different way than people with other eating disorders might have. And so their unique experiences with body image distress and how we treat that might be much more targeted or intensive than in a different eating disorder treatment kind of modality or program. We do find that it's really helpful to have specific binge eating disorder programs that are separate from other eating disorders because of those unique challenges. And yes, there is restriction in a lot of binge eating disorder, people who have binge eating disorder, but it's not necessarily as encompassing as it is for the other diagnoses. And so having a very dedicated special space for people who struggle with binge eating, we find to be really supportive and helpful for our patients.
We actually have a support group dedicated specifically to folks with binge eating disorder that came about after such a strong community need. And I lead one of our general groups, and we see people in there who share all kinds of behaviors, diagnoses, struggles, and they're getting a lot of support. But yeah, we had such a big ask for people to have that space. So we were very happy to be able to share that.
Yeah, that's awesome. We've noticed that as well, right? Which is why we have our own separate binge eating disorder track and program.
Mhm. So in that you talked a little bit about, body image, weight stigma. How do you address that? How can folks maybe navigating recovery, whether early or ongoing, how does that get tied into BED recovery?
I think each person's experience with their body image and the distress related to that can be so unique. It can carry a lot of heaviness to it with how much it impacts your eating disorder for some people versus others. It's just not as big of a component. And so targeting that is different for each person. But I do think that body image distress with binge eating disorder can be one of the predominant things that leads to a binge cycle. And so being really mindful about addressing that is a huge piece. We also talk about different tools that we can use when we're addressing body image distress and then how we cope with that, right? How patients would cope with body image distress can often be restriction, which leads to binging because we're hungry, right? We still need the sustenance and food and the body is asking for it. And so oftentimes there can be this binge cycle that happens. And so I've found that one of the things that I use with my patients with our program is to encourage this concept of urge surfing. Or kind of trigger delay, or sorry, binge disorder, binge eating disorder. Gosh, I'm so tongue tied. Binge eating disorder and using urge surfing can be a great way to kind of mitigate the triggers that come along with body image distress.
Hmm.
So urge surfing is kind of like what it sounds like. You can even imagine an urge being like a giant wave that you ride along, kind of letting yourself go through the motions until that wave rides itself into flatness. And what it is about predominantly is noticing, okay, I've got a trigger occurring. I can feel myself wanting to engage in some sort of behavior, whether that be restriction or binging or body checking or over exercising, compensatory behaviors, you name it. We found that urge surfing, allowing yourself to say, okay, I'm not going to engage in this behavior right now. I'm going to see if I can go do some other things to ride the wave of how intense it feels to want to go do that behavior. And then see if anything is different. If I check in first about like, how do I feel right now with this urge? Is it really intense? What are my thoughts going through my head? How distressed do I feel? Let me go try surfing this urge and see if I can use some other coping skills and check back in 15 minutes. So
Hmm.
instead of saying, just never do this behavior again, this behavior which has become so adaptive for somebody, right? It can be one of the things that's like helping you keep your head above water, if we're kind of using that surfing metaphor. And so it can be really challenging to join a program and say, hey, stop doing this behavior altogether. That's a lot to expect, to just say
Hmm.
never ever again. Well, it's been something that's been helping you to kind of live life at this point. It's been maladaptive, but it's still provided some support or you wouldn't be doing it. So using the surfing as a means to say, I'm not going to engage in this right now, but not never. I can give myself permission later, but let me just try some other things right now. That can still kind of provide the comfort of like, I'm not saying I can never use this behavior that helps me to feel better sometimes ever again, just not right now. And starting to see if it makes a difference in how intense the trigger feels.
Yeah, that seems like a really accessible approach too, and
Yeah,
a way to really reframe things, right?
totally.
I hear from so many people with a really all or nothing mindset. It's not like, hey,
Yes.
I was able to completely stop and I am now perfect. I'm done with behaviors.
Yeah.
Hooray.
Yeah.
There's a lot of room between I'm gonna start trying and completely done. And I
Yeah.
think urge surfing to me feels like a really good way to kind of reframe that because you're taking time, right? And
Yes.
any amount of time is progress. And that's a
Yes.
really a good way to frame it up for yourself. Like, today I was able to surf that urge for 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Maybe next week I'll get to five, like whatever that looks like.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's a nice way to kind of quantify things too and see if there's any
Mhm.
change. If we do a check in before we urge surf and then another check in afterwards, gaining that insight can be so helpful around, wow, yeah, I did do some sort of coping skill that I've learned. And yeah, I actually don't feel I still feel a little bit bad, but I don't feel as bad. Any
Mhm.
type of shift in developing insight into how we're feeling and how to intervene is a win. That's a success. Absolutely.
I love that. And I'm one of our group leaders, and something that comes up a lot. We sometimes ask people to like, oh, look for a win from today. And every
Mm,
once in a while, we get someone who's like, I just didn't have one. But
yeah.
showing up
Yes.
is a win sometimes. Just trying, reaching out even when it's hard. That can be such a win. And I really like this tool because it seems like even just noticing, like there are so many points at which you can have little wins within this tool. I like it.
Absolutely. I often think about eating disorder recovery as not necessarily like an abstinence-based experience. And
Mhm.
it's that can be really intimidating, right? Like I'm just never gonna do these things that have been a huge part of my life ever. But rather it's more about an insight developing kind of process where I'm just learning more about myself and my triggers and my behaviors and why do I do some of these things? And if I can understand why I do them, maybe I can understand what else I can do instead to help myself to feel better rather than continuing down this path that I know is ultimately really destructive for
Yeah.
me.
So it's not always all about the behaviors.
Yeah, very true. Yeah. A lot of times it's just learning about yourself.
That can be a really scary thing, but I think ultimately fulfilling.
Yeah, definitely.
Another thing that I think is really helpful that when we're talking about coping skills, something to think about is the idea of practicing them, right?
Mm, yeah.
Like it's not you learn a skill and you go off and do it perfectly every single time immediately. And this is something that comes up a lot too. People saying like, "Hey, I tried this and it just didn't work." But like, okay, how much have you tried it? Did you try it when you were just a little escalated, or did you try to jump right in for the first time when you were having a truly horrible, no good, very bad day, right?
Yeah. 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 I think that that's very clear for a lot of people that you almost aren't even like called to try a coping skill until you realize you're so distressed. It's like, I need to do
Hmm.
something now because of how bad I feel. But
Yeah.
rather doing kind of smaller things at the beginning where you notice, yeah, I'm just a little bothered. Let me go try this skill. Or even trying the skill a few times before you really think you need it, just to kind of get that muscle memory down of, yeah, what are the steps that I'm supposed to take? Let me practice that. Because we know that when we are activated and triggered, it's a lot harder for us to remember all the different parts of things that might be required for a coping skill, or even something as simple as deep breathing. Like your brain isn't necessarily going to access that when it's overwhelmed. And so having the
Hmm.
practice of, oh yeah, what is deep breathing or what is square breathing? I know how to do that when I'm calm. So it's a lot easier to transfer over when I'm not feeling so calm. That
Yeah.
can make a big difference.
What is square breathing?
Square breathing. Square breathing is, if you can imagine a square, and some people do, like you breathe in for the same amount of time, you breathe out for the same amount of time, you breathe in, you breathe out. Some people do a different variation of that, but all of them are a square. So it helps you to remember to breathe in. Some people like to hold it, breathe out, hold it, breathe in. It really
Oh,
just
okay.
makes a little square to remind yourself of like, oh, I'm supposed to breathe in and out. And it's a nice little visual to think about making a square. I think sometimes it's, again, one of those things that's a little bit simpler to call upon than maybe something that's a more complicated coping skill.
Yeah. But again, I imagine even if it's simple, the
Yeah,
practice is what really makes it accessible. And
yeah,
using your breathing or your urge surfing when you're mildly irritated, like building,
yeah,
I guess, the muscle, like as
yes.
before you try to jump into a really stressful situation.
Yes. I kind of use a metaphor about like working out a muscle or like building muscle. Like you're not going to go to the gym and try to lift like your, I don't know, gazillion pounds all of this the first day that you're there, right? Like your muscles just don't have that. We know that.
Mhm.
We know that it takes muscle building to be able to lift things. And so, similar to recovery, it's like building a muscle. So, yeah, if you go right out the gate trying to use a coping skill in the most overwhelming moment, yeah, that's like lifting a ton of weight above your head the first day you go to learn how to build a muscle. So, repetition over time can really build that muscle so that it's stronger, it's easier to call upon, and before you know it, you're picking up 1,000 pounds and throwing it over your head like it's nothing. But that takes time and practice and building that muscle, and your brain is that kind of muscle too, right? Learning how to do all those different things and making it a little bit more automatic than it is having to really think through all of it.
Yeah. I feel like so many people really understand like intuitively like okay you need to build your like physical muscles if you're trying to like get to whatever goal it is, but we just don't have the same grace for ourselves in so
So
many ways when it comes to mental emotional regulation and building that practice those muscles too.
yeah, yeah, that is hard, right? Especially because we can often be in a part of a culture or society that's so self-critical, that there's like harsh self-punishment, or even our peers can be really critical of us. And so it is kind of an adaptive thing that we've learned to be harsh on ourselves in order to not be rejected by others. But
Mm,
we take it a little too far oftentimes, and
yeah.
become a little too harsh and too mean to ourselves. And that just gets in the way of all the things. So it is hard. It's really challenging. It's not just your own internal critic, it's also the way that society talks about people. And that informs
Mhm.
how you think about yourself.
Bringing it right back around to weight stigma.
Oh, yeah, right on back.
So I guess we're talking about these coping skills and practicing and building up those muscles for you. And again, throwing another big question at you here, but what is recovery? Is it like having all of these tools, being able to use them perfectly every time? Like what does recovery look like?
Yeah, I think oftentimes it's easier for us to think in black and white. Right? Like there isn't nuance, there isn't gray. It's either I am deep in my eating disorder or I am fully recovered and I never think about any of these things ever again. But that's just not the realistic case about it. I mean, there's such a spectrum of what recovery can look like for each person in each given moment, even.
Hmm.
It can look drastically different from day to day, from moment to moment. So it really is unique to each person and how they define their own recovery. But what I consider to be recovery too is if you kind of pull back and look at the longer timeline of your experience in your eating disorder. Do you feel like you're generally trending in a direction that feels life affirming and supportive and fulfilling? Generally, right? Not like actually in those moment to moment, but over the course of time, if you kind of pull back and look at your journey, do you feel like you've moved in a direction that just feels more supportive for you? And if so, that's a great way to measure recovery, that you're feeling better, that life feels more enjoyable, that you've made progress in some way. But looking at it too narrow and too to like this week or this month can really end up just putting you into that circle of harsh self-criticism and being disappointed in yourself and all of those things that actually can make our eating disorder so much worse because we're being a bit mean to ourselves. And so giving yourself some grace around what your own recovery looks like, I think is really important.
I completely agree. And you mentioned black and white thinking. I, for so long, I assumed there was like a finish line, right?
Yeah.
Like I would cross it and then past
I'm
that,
done. Yeah.
everything would be sunshine and rainbows forever. Like there would be, I would just be happy at all times, never have negative emotion, never like have to, cope with anything. But that's not life, right? Like life keeps happening and things keep being hard and finding ways to cope that are life affirming. I think that's what it looks like for me. And I've said this in groups too, right? It recovery doesn't mean everything's easy.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, it can be really hard. I mean, that's if it
Yep.
wasn't hard, we wouldn't all need to be here, right? Like there's a reason why this is so challenging. And I think being really mindful of the way that you are judging yourself in your recovery is supportive of your recovery. Again, just building more of that insight about the way that you engage with your eating disorder, your experience of food and body in the world, weight stigma, and all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's all so much more nuanced than just a nice, clear finish line.
Oh, it is so nuanced. Yeah, but wouldn't it be so easy if we could just say I crossed the finish line of eating disorder recovery and I never have to worry about this ever again?
Done, everybody.
Yeah, wouldn't it be nice?
World record
Yes.
time here.
Yeah.
Ah, but man, and I think life really does just keep happening, right?
It sure does.
And we just keep looping around here, but all of these things are so tied together. Like being able to think through the ways we cope with life, with our feelings, with changes.
Yeah.
It it really is a practice.
Yes. Yeah. And if going back to that kind of muscle concept, right? Like things can
Mhm.
feel really going really smooth, really easy. Like, yeah, my eating disorder isn't very loud, or I'm not really struggling with this much. And so you are hoping that you're closer to the finish line if that's the way that you're looking at it. But life happens, things happen, change occurs, tragedies occur, grief
Mhm.
occurs. And in those moments, it's so much easier to, maybe for some people, to lean on those old behaviors because they're
Yeah.
comforting. We know how to do them really well. It's a space that we know. And so having to turn from that in moments that are really, really hard is really, really hard. A lot of people can go through changes or parts of life where things get harder and say like there's no reason my eating disorder should be louder right now. I'm past this. I thought I was recovered. Well, life gets hard and it's okay that this can come back and say like, hey, I want to be part of the world again. And you can say like, no, I don't want that. But it can still be
Mhm.
loud and still be present because it was like a muscle. It was strong at one point. It was something that you used pretty regularly. But choosing to turn away from that and engage in other things intentionally builds the other muscle of recovery much stronger. So it's almost like you're in this recovery path, you've built this muscle so far, and someone's like, actually, more though. Like, we're going to make this a little bit harder on you. You're like, oh, my muscles are so shaky of this recovery muscle. But
You've
the
upped
more
the
that
weight. Yeah.
yeah, you've upped the weight. And so it's like, I don't know if I can do it. This is a lot of extra on me that I'm trying to cope with and manage. And so it's understandable that you'd want to try and find some other muscle that you know is strong to lift that
Mhm.
weight. But again, choosing those other muscles to work out instead to like truly make that a stronger muscle is going to be supportive of the journey in the long haul. But it's also understandable why you'd want to lean on the other muscles work too to kind of lift some of that weight.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's all part of the journey.
The journey is long for a lot of
Yes.
folks. It can be tiring. And something I hear a lot is people who have been putting in the work, right? Like really doing it, really doing the practice, and they're tired.
Mhm.
How do you approach people who maybe are just saying like, oh, all of this work of recovery is a lot, and there's other pieces of my life that are really big right now.
Yeah. I think that's also unique to each person, the nuance, right? The living in the gray of, well, what is it that's impacting you right now? You are really tired. You're exhausted from how much work this is to try and recover, to try and choose these alternative behaviors that are more life affirming and supportive. And um, with individuals who are feeling burnt out on treatment or just so
Mhm.
tired of having to fight, to fight, to fight, like you had said, still showing up, giving yourself credit for those things that you're still engaging in those recovery behaviors is really important to boost up your ability to feel like I'm still making forward progress. Because if we are feeling really tired in our recovery, if we're feeling exhausted from how much work that it is, if we're also adding on judgment about how hard it has become, well, we're making it even harder for ourselves. And so approaching yourself with compassion and understanding, yeah, this is hard work. Getting tired makes sense. It's understandable that maybe I'm going to be falling into old behaviors sometimes because of how hard this is. But approaching yourself with that compassion and kindness is so important. And I will say that there is a difference between self being, kind to yourself or nice to yourself versus having self compassion, where you say,
Hmm.
look, yes, I can say nice things about myself. But ultimately, I believe there are certain nice things about humanity in general, things that human beings in general need to have to be affirmed and feel fulfilled. And one of those, many of those things are about feeling like you are part of a whole, a connected group, to feel as though the things that I struggle with are not unique to me, but part of humanity overall. And I can have compassion for myself because I can have compassion for other people, that life is hard. Things come at you. People deserve to have compassion, and I am people. So being able to kind of reflect some of that back to yourself and say, yes, I can say all these like positive affirmations and that's great. But if it doesn't feel like that's really doing the trick, well, I do believe that people deserve compassion and empathy and kindness. And I'm included in that. Can kind of build some of the energy that you need to kind of keep a forward momentum if possible.
I love that. And just in case someone needs to hear it, if you have a slip, if you have a behavior, does it undo the progress you've made?
No, 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 of course not. You can have a slew of behaviors. It does not undo the
Mhm.
progress. Like I said, building insight is a big part of this, right? A lot of
Yeah.
times we don't get rid of that insight. Once it's there, we've learned something about ourselves that we might forget later on, but oftentimes that knowledge is still there. And so just because you've slipped into old behaviors doesn't mean you've lost the progress of what you've learned about yourself in your mind, right? You've learned, oh, here are the things that actually trigger me to engage in these behaviors, which I hadn't really deeply thought about before. But now that I know, I can plan ahead when I think those triggers might arise and I can do something different. And maybe things got hard and I slipped into old behaviors, and that's okay because I know generally I'm making a forward momentum and I know that I'm working hard to do these things. And I have some self compassion that even if I'm struggling, it doesn't mean something about me as a person. It means that I maybe need a little compassion and some grace and some space for myself to be human.
It's like we're all just humans.
Yeah. Oh, what a concept, right?
I know, right?
We're all just little people running around trying to figure out our lives.
All doing our best, trying to
Yeah.
cope, learning ways to do that are life affirming. And you've said that a couple times. Could you clarify, like, what does life affirming mean
Yeah.
for you?
Yeah. For me, life affirming means it's a behavior, it's a thought process, it's something that I'm engaging in that feels supportive of a life worth living as defined by me. So having a life worth living looks different for each person, right? Somebody might feel like a life worth living is lots of adventure and exploring, and that's great. That's very life affirming for them. For me, maybe it's I like to cozy in and like knit my little projects or color my little coloring books, and that feels really life affirming. So it's unique to each
Mhm.
person, but what it means is that I'm doing something that feels like I am engaging in a life or building a life that is what I want, is what's for me, is the
Yeah.
definition of what Alicia wants for her life. Maybe not Kristen or anybody else, but for me, this behavior or this thing that I'm engaging in is supportive of that life. rather than maybe an eating disorder behavior, right? Where if all those little things are important to me about staying cozy in my home and like having these little tasks that I do and these cute little hobbies, yeah, if I look at my eating disorder behaviors, like that's not really any part of that. Like the life that I want to live does not include that. And so kind of having the process of every so often checking in with yourself to say, like, is this affirming of the life that I want to build and live for myself? And using that as a reminder to say, like, or a guide, really, like a compass of, am I headed in the direction of like building this life or continuing this life that I really love or that I want to create for myself? It can be a nice little way to steer some of like, what am I doing? And is this right or is this wrong? Well, does it get you closer to this thing, this life that you want for yourself? That's what life affirming means to me.
I love that. And everything you're talking about is just so whole picture human. Like
Oh,
none of this is just about the eating disorder or
yeah.
behaviors. It's all about who you are. And I imagine some of the work is figuring that out, right? Like what does it mean to be life affirming for you, right?
Yeah. And there are a lot of people who say, man, I don't really know. I've never really thought about it for myself. I've kind of just gone along with what society kind of says you're supposed to have, right? Like you're supposed
Mhm.
to go to school and graduate and get married and have the kids and buy the house. You know, you're supposed to do
All
the
the
things,
shoulds. Yeah.
all
I
the
should do
shoulds,
this next.
exactly, all the shoulds. And the reality is that what you want? I don't know.
Mhm.
Have you been given the space to actually think about what it is that you do want? And especially in eating disorder recovery, where we are in the illness, like very deep into often what we think other people expect of us and have what their life affirming is for us is someone else's wish, someone else's goal, someone else's critique, and
Mhm.
to stop and say, what is it that is mine? Like, what do I actually
Yeah.
want? Can be really hard, really, really hard for some people because they've never had to do it before. And so
Mhm.
it's a task, it's a practice. And so once you finally have built that picture, which is hard to do, it can be a little easier to see where we're going. It's kind of like it creates a roadmap a little bit of like, yeah, where is my destination? Like what kind of life do I want to build for myself? And now I know the steps I might need to take along the way to get me there, to live this life that feels affirmed to the things that I want, not just what the outer world around me wants for myself or wants for me.
Wow. That is really, really beautiful.
Yeah, I really love self-compassion, life affirm, like
Mhm.
creating a values-driven life, but is meaningful for you specifically, like giving yourself the agency and autonomy to say,
Yeah.
I deserve to have these things that I want, and it's within my reach, and I can grab for it. I can grasp it. I can do the things I need to try and get myself there.
Alicia, thank you so much for talking this through, for joining us. I'm gonna have to think more about what's life affirming for Kristen.
Yeah,
It,
maybe.
I think it's a really beautiful thing and something I'm going to spend a little bit more time thinking about. I'm inspired after this conversation.
Yeah, I hope all of our watchers and listeners are too, to kind of take
I
that moment
hope
to be
so
like,
too.
what is for
Yeah.
me versus what other people want for me.
Yeah. Okay. Well, again, thank you so much. It's
Thank you
been
for
a
having
real
me.
joy talking to you, and I hope you have a really incredible rest of your day.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. You too. Thanks for having me.